Welcome to Voice of Sovereign Africa. Here, we examine power beyond headlines. Today's story is not about an arrest. It is about why the world was ready to believe it.
The world reacts faster than it thinks. Before facts settle, narratives move. And once a narrative moves far enough, it no longer needs proof to feel real. Over the last day, a claim moved across the internet with speed. A claim suggesting that the Venezuelan president had been arrested under pressure connected to Donald Trump. Some believed it immediately. Some questioned it. Some celebrated it. Some feared it. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The most important part of this story is not whether the arrest happened. The most important part is that millions of people found the story believable. That belief tells us more about the global order than any confirmed headline ever could. In today's world, power does not always need to act to dominate. Power needs only to create the sense that action is possible. Once that sense exists, fear, compliance, and hesitation begin to do the work. This is how modern geopolitical pressure functions. Not through tanks crossing borders, but through narratives crossing minds. For decades, leaders who refuse alignment with Western political or economic interests have followed a predictable trajectory. First, they are described as controversial, then irresponsible, then dangerous, then criminal. The language always comes before the punishment. And once the language sticks, any outcome feels justified. So when a claim surfaces involving pressure against Nicolas Maduro, it fits neatly into a mental framework people already recognize. It sounds familiar. It feels consistent. It aligns with what history has trained the world to expect. That is not an accident. Sanctions, asset freezes, legal indictments, travel restrictions, and international isolation have become normalized tools of enforcement. They are presented as lawful, moral, and necessary. But to those on the receiving end, they function as warnings. And warnings do not need to be executed to be effective. A warning only needs to be seen. This is where Africa enters the conversation. Not as a passive observer, but as a region that has lived through every phase of this pattern before. African leaders understand something that outside analysts often ignore. The moment a leader places sovereignty above alignment, attention follows. Not supportive attention. Corrective attention. This is why even rumors matter. Because rumors reflect expectations. And expectations reflect power structures. Somewhere in West Africa, a young military leader governs a nation under pressure. Security challenges. Economic strain. Regional instability. Foreign interests watching closely. Ibrahim Traoré does not need to issue a statement about Venezuela to understand what the story represents. He does not need confirmation to grasp the implication. The implication is already clear. The implication is that independence exists only as long as it remains tolerable. Traore speaks openly about sovereignty, about control over resources, about rejecting foreign military presence, about redefining partnerships. None of these positions are radical to ordinary citizens. But in global power structures, clarity is treated as defiance. The world does not punish silence. It punishes articulation. When a leader speaks too plainly about autonomy, the system responds by reframing them. Not as a reformer. Not as a nationalist. But as unstable. Once instability is established, intervention becomes a discussion. And once intervention becomes a discussion, legitimacy begins to erode. This is the invisible pressure that shapes leadership decisions across the global South. Venezuela's experience, real or perceived, operates as a mirror. Not because Burkina Faso fears arrest tomorrow, but because leaders understand trajectory. They understand that today's rumor is tomorrow's sanction. And tomorrow's sanction is next year's justification. This is how deterrence works without deployment. Western power does not need to remove every resistant leader. It only needs to remove enough to set precedent. And precedent travels faster than policy. The idea that a sitting president could be targeted, restrained, or neutralized sends a quiet message across capitals. That message does not say, "This will happen to you." It says, "This could." And could is enough. In Burkina Faso, sovereignty is not theoretical. It is survival. The state is rebuilding itself under pressure. Security threats are real. Resources are contested. Influence is negotiated daily. In such an environment, global signals carry weight. Every action, rumor, or legal maneuver elsewhere becomes a data point. Traoré's leadership exists inside this reality, not in isolation, not in defiance for spectacle, but in calculation. This is what many outside observers misunderstand. They treat African leaders as reactive, but in truth they are adaptive. They observe. They remember. They anticipate. The Venezuela narrative is not about Venezuela alone. It is part of a long continuum that stretches back decades. A continuum where sovereignty is tolerated until it disrupts interests. This is why Africa watches carefully, not emotionally, strategically. And this is why this story matters. Because it reminds the world that power still prefers obedience, that independence still carries a cost, and that leaders who refuse to soften their language must prepare for pressure that arrives quietly first. In the next part, we will go deeper into how media framing shapes global consent, how legal language replaces military force, and why figures like Traore become symbols rather than individuals. Not because they seek symbolism, but because the system needs examples. Power rarely announces itself directly anymore. It prefers distance. It prefers process. It prefers language that sounds neutral while producing very specific outcomes. This is why media matters more now than missiles ever did. Because media does not conquer territory. It conquers interpretation. When a leader challenges the prevailing order, the first response is not force. The first response is framing. How the leader is described. How often. By whom. And in what tone. Words such as unstable, controversial, authoritarian, illegitimate begin to appear. At first cautiously. Then casually. Then constantly. Once repetition sets in, resistance fades. The audience becomes conditioned. And when consequences arrive, they feel earned. This is how global consent is manufactured. Look closely at how leaders are presented depending on alignment. Those who cooperate are flawed but pragmatic. Those who resist are dangerous by nature. This contrast is not accidental. It is structural. Legal language plays a central role in this process. Because legality sounds objective, neutral, civilized. Arrest warrants, investigations, sanctions, compliance frameworks. These terms create distance between cause and effect. No one says punishment. They say enforcement. No one says coercion. They say accountability. No one says removal. They say transition. This allows power to act while claiming restraint. So when conversations appear online about possible action against Nicolas Maduro, they operate within this established framework. The mind has already been trained. The audience has already been prepared. That preparation is what matters. Because preparation creates inevitability. Once the public believes a leader is illegitimate, almost anything becomes acceptable. Asset seizures, travel bans, isolation, even detention. And because it is framed as law, resistance becomes difficult. Africa understands this deeply. Not from theory. From experience. Legal instruments have long been used to justify external pressure on African states. Debt conditions, aid compliance, security cooperation requirements. Each instrument appears reasonable on its own. Together they create dependency. This is why sovereignty is not abstract rhetoric for leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. It is a response to decades of conditional governance. When Traoré speaks about self-determination, he is not rejecting partnership. He is rejecting hierarchy. And hierarchy is what the system defends most aggressively. This is why media narratives matter so much. Because once a leader is defined as a problem, hierarchy is restored. The leader is no longer a decision maker. He becomes a subject of analysis, a case study, a risk factor. From that point forward, policy discussions shift. They are no longer about cooperation. They are about containment. This is what Venezuela represents symbolically. Not because of its geography, but because of its persistence. For years, pressure did not produce collapse. Sanctions did not deliver submission. Isolation did not force alignment. That defiance frustrates power structures, because it challenges the assumption that pressure always works. And when pressure fails, escalation becomes tempting. This is why even unverified claims generate intense reaction. They signal potential escalation. They suggest that limits may be shifting. For African leaders watching closely, this matters, because the question is no longer whether pressure exists. That is understood. The question is how far it is willing to go. Traore governs in a region where external security involvement has been normalized for decades. Bases, advisors, operations. Rejecting those arrangements is not symbolic. It disrupts existing power flows. Disruption invites response. But response does not always come immediately. It often comes gradually, through reputational damage, through diplomatic friction, through economic pressure. The goal is not collapse. The goal is compliance. This is why the idea of a leader being targeted carries such weight. It implies that compliance is no longer optional. Whether or not such actions materialize, the suggestion alone reshapes calculations. It makes leaders cautious. It makes allies hesitant. It makes investors nervous. Pressure does not need to succeed fully. It only needs to slow momentum. This is how resistance is managed. Not crushed. Contained. The global order prefers predictable partners. Not passionate ones. Not ideological ones. Predictable ones. Traore's challenge is not that he governs poorly. It is that he governs clearly. Clarity disrupts ambiguity. And ambiguity is how power hides. This is why voices that speak plainly are treated as threats. Because they remove plausible deniability. They force the system to respond. And the response is rarely immediate. It is procedural, incremental, disguised as concern. Concern for democracy. Concern for stability. Concern for human rights. These concerns are not false. But they are selective. They appear loudly in some cases, silently in others. This selectivity is what African audiences recognize instantly, which is why the Venezuela narrative resonates beyond Latin America. It confirms something many already believe, that resistance is punished not because it fails, but because it persists, and that persistence inspires others. This is what power fears most: contagion. Not military contagion. Ideological contagion. The idea that sovereignty is achievable, that alternatives exist, that compliance is not inevitable. This is why figures like Traore become symbols, not because they seek attention, but because their stance disrupts expectations. They remind others that alignment is a choice, not a law, and choices threaten systems built on inevitability. In the final part, we will examine what this means for Africa's future, how younger populations interpret these signals, and why the struggle over narrative control is accelerating. Because the next phase of global power will not be decided by force alone. It will be decided by belief. The future of power will not be announced with declarations. It will reveal itself through patterns, through what is tolerated, through what is punished, through what is allowed to stand. Across Africa, a generational shift is taking place. Younger populations are more connected, more informed, and less patient with inherited narratives. They watch global events closely. They compare outcomes. They notice contradictions. This generation does not accept explanations at face value. They ask why similar actions produce different responses depending on who performs them. They ask why sovereignty is praised in theory but resisted in practice. They ask why independence becomes controversial only when it affects control. These questions change the political environment. They place leaders under new pressure. Not pressure to conform outwardly, but pressure to act authentically. This is where figures like Traore gain symbolic weight. Not because they promise perfection, but because they represent refusal. Refusal to soften language for approval. Refusal to outsource legitimacy. Refusal to govern through apology. In a world where power prefers quiet compliance, refusal stands out. This is why narratives matter more than outcomes. Because the battle is no longer only about who controls territory. It is about who controls meaning. If resistance can be framed as instability, it loses appeal. If sovereignty can be framed as recklessness, it becomes risky. If independence can be framed as isolation, it becomes undesirable. This is the real contest. Not between nations, between interpretations. This is why rumors, speculation, and unverified claims move markets, shift alliances, and influence public mood. They feed interpretation. They test boundaries. They ask a simple question without speaking it aloud. How far can power go before it must act openly? Africa understands this question because it has lived with its consequences. From externally supported transitions to conditional aid frameworks, the continent has learned that pressure rarely arrives without justification. And justification is almost always narrative-driven. This is why control over narrative is now as valuable as control over resources. Leaders who understand this invest in messaging. They speak directly. They avoid ambiguity. They frame their actions before others do. This is not propaganda. It is defense. Because silence allows others to define you. The Venezuela story, regardless of its factual outcome, serves as a reminder of this reality. It shows how quickly interpretation solidifies, how fast belief forms, how easily legitimacy is questioned. For African leaders, this reinforces one lesson. If you do not define your position, it will be defined for you. This is why rhetoric around sovereignty has intensified. Not because leaders are becoming more radical, but because the environment is becoming less forgiving. Neutrality is shrinking. Alignment is demanded. And refusal is interpreted as opposition. In such a climate, standing firm requires preparation, economic resilience, security autonomy, public trust. Without these, pressure works. This is why the conversation is shifting from individual leaders to systems, from personalities to structures. Because removing one figure does not eliminate the desire for independence. It often strengthens it. History shows this repeatedly. Pressure creates martyrs. Silencing creates symbols. Intervention creates memory. And memory outlasts power. The current global order underestimates this dynamic. It assumes that compliance equals stability. But compliance without consent breeds resentment. Resentment does not disappear. It accumulates. This is what younger African audiences understand instinctively. They do not romanticize leadership. They evaluate outcomes. They watch how leaders are treated externally. They observe who is respected and who is constrained. They draw conclusions. This is why attempts to intimidate through example often backfire. They expose fear. They reveal that resistance matters enough to warrant response. And that revelation is powerful. For Traore and others navigating this terrain, the challenge is not to avoid pressure. Pressure is inevitable. The challenge is to convert pressure into legitimacy at home. To show that resistance is not chaos. That sovereignty is not isolation. That independence is not hostility. This is where narrative control becomes decisive. Not through slogans. Through consistency. Through aligning words with action. Through demonstrating that autonomy delivers results. This is the only counterweight to external framing. The Venezuela narrative illustrates the stakes. It reminds the world that power still reacts aggressively to defiance. But it also reminds emerging leaders that defiance still exists. And that existence alone matters. Because it proves that the system is not absolute. That alternatives remain possible. That history is not finished. Africa is not choosing confrontation. It is choosing definition. The question is not whether pressure will continue. It will. The question is whether the next generation will accept the explanations that accompany it. And judging by the conversations unfolding across the continent, the answer is increasingly clear. The warning embedded in global narratives is being heard. But it is not producing silence. It is producing resolve.